Why doesn't Europe build skyscrapers? Walk through any major European capital, Paris, London, Rome, and one thing immediately stands out compared to New York, Shanghai, or Dubai: the near total absence of skyscrapers. This isn't a coincidence. It's also not because Europe lacks the technical or financial ability to build tall buildings. This pattern is actually rooted in a series of decisions made over centuries about how a city should look and function. In this video, we're breaking down why a continent home to some of the oldest and wealthiest cities in the world chose to stay low, quite literally, while cities elsewhere in the world raced to build upward. When skyscrapers first emerged in the late 19th century in Chicago and then New York, most European cities were actually already firmly established. This is a fundamental difference that's important to understand. American cities like Chicago and New York were, at the time, still relatively young and growing rapidly, with plenty of open land available for construction. European cities, meanwhile, were already densely packed with grand historic buildings and public squares that had stood for hundreds of years, leaving very little open space to build massive new towers. Just imagine trying to slot a modern skyscraper into the middle of an existing network of narrow streets and historic buildings in a city like Paris or Rome. Physically, this isn't just an architectural challenge. It's a space problem baked into the city's structure from the very start. European cities at the time also had a far more evenly distributed zoning pattern compared to America's rapidly growing cities. In younger, faster-growing cities, there's usually heavily concentrated demand for floor space in specific districts, typically the central business district. This concentrated demand is what naturally drives high-rise construction, since the most efficient way to meet such massive demand for space in a limited area is to build upward. But European cities didn't have this same concentrated demand pattern. Economic, commercial, and residential activity tended to be spread more evenly across the city rather than centered in a single district. Without this kind of concentrated demand pressure, there was no strong economic push to build upward in the first place. There's also a fairly interesting cultural factor worth discussing here. As American influence grew on the world stage, a cultural rivalry began taking shape between the two continents. Americans increasingly viewed Europe's class-based traditions as outdated, while many Europeans saw American ideals as eroding their own heritage. This dynamic created a situation where each continent grew fairly wary of copying the other's urban model. For many European cities, skyscrapers began to be associated with American urban identity, something symbolically different from the historical identity and heritage Europe was already so proud of. This isn't just about aesthetic preference alone, but a deeper sense of cultural identity about what a European city was supposed to look like. One cautionary experiment shaped European urban policy for decades to come: what happened in Brussels. In the 1960s and 70s, Brussels tore down large numbers of historic buildings to replace them with modern high-rises. This wave of construction turned out to be so unpopular with the public that the phenomenon actually produced its own name: Brusselisation, a term now used as shorthand to describe a city being overrun by soulless towers, stripped of its original character. The backlash against this Brussels experiment was so strong that it became a cautionary lesson for other European cities for decades to follow. This is a real example of how one publicly failed urban experiment can shape city planning policy across an entire continent for a very long time. This backlash against Brusselisation pushed most European cities toward a different compromise: designating dedicated districts specifically for skyscrapers, deliberately set apart from the historic city center. The most famous examples of this approach are Canary Wharf in London and La Défense in Paris. Both districts were specifically designed as areas where tall buildings could be built freely without disrupting the historic old city core. This is a fairly elegant solution to balancing two seemingly conflicting needs: the modern economic demand for high-rise office space with the desire to preserve the historic character of a city center that had stood for centuries. By separating these two functions geographically, these cities could get the best of both worlds: modern economic growth without sacrificing their historic identity. London took this preservation concept even further, with regulations known as protected views. These regulations legally guarantee unobstructed sightlines to iconic landmarks like St. Paul's Cathedral, Big Ben, and Westminster Palace. This isn't just a loose guideline. It's a regulation that specifically forces architects to design new buildings around invisible view corridors, stretching for miles across the city. Just imagine this challenge from an architect's perspective. You don't just have to think about the design of your own building, but also make sure it doesn't block a sight line that might stretch quite far, toward a historic landmark that might not even be directly visible from the construction site. This is an extremely detailed and disciplined level of city planning, one that directly limits where and how tall a new building can be built. Across the European continent, dense pre-industrial city centers with narrow streets and protected sightlines physically limit where very tall buildings can even be placed. Beyond these physical limitations, there are also strong preservation rules, specifically designed to protect a city's skyline silhouette and historic districts. These rules aren't just bureaucratic formalities. They're serious legal frameworks, reflecting a deep commitment to preserving a city's visual and historic character. The combination of physical limitations inherited from the past and deliberate preservation regulations in the present creates a system that effectively makes large-scale skyscraper construction extremely difficult, except in special districts specifically designed for that purpose. Beyond regulation, there's also a cultural preference factor playing an important role here. Many Europeans prefer living closer to the ground, in houses or low-rise apartments, rather than in tall towers. This is a lifestyle preference that shapes market demand just as powerfully as any zoning regulation. Even if regulations allowed for high-rise construction in a certain area without strong market demand from consumers who genuinely want to live or work in those tall buildings, the economic incentive to build them becomes far weaker. This is an important reminder that a city's landscape isn't just shaped by what's legally permitted, but also by what the people living in it genuinely want. As one architecture blog once put it, Europe doesn't lack skyscrapers because it can't build them. It lacks them because it values something else more: the preservation of history, the comfort of the pedestrian, and the sustainability of the environment. This is an extremely fitting way to sum up this entire phenomenon. It's not about a limitation in ability. Europe clearly has the technical and financial resources to build as many skyscrapers as it wants, as proven by districts like Canary Wharf and La Défense. It's about a different set of value priorities, one that consciously chooses to put other things ahead of the ambition to build toward the sky. The result is a continent where a city's greatness isn't measured by how close its buildings reach toward the stars, but by how well its streets serve the people walking on the ground. This is a deliberate trade-off, not just an accident of economics. Every decision we've covered throughout this video, from cities already densely established from the start, to London's protected view regulations, to a cultural preference for living close to the ground, all reflect a conscious choice to prioritize certain values over others. This doesn't mean one approach is more correct than the other. Cities with towering skyscrapers have their own advantages: spatial efficiency, a symbol of economic progress, and density that can support more efficient public transit infrastructure. But European cities show there's another equally valid path: prioritizing historic preservation, human-scale urban design, and the pedestrian experience over vertical ambition. Ultimately, a city's landscape, whether filled with towering skyscrapers or low historic buildings, isn't just the result of technical ability or economic limitation alone. It's a reflection of values consciously chosen by the people who built it, generation after generation. If you enjoy discussions like this about architecture, city planning, and urban history, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss other interesting breakdowns. See you in the next video.